This is a Fox News alert. I'm Bret Baier in Washington. Less than 24 hours after voting concluded in New Hampshire, the Republican caravan is already in South Carolina, minus two of its passengers. The GOP's only female candidate, Fiorina, is out. And New Jersey Governor Christie is also out. Chief political correspondent Carl Cameron is in Seabrook, New Hampshire, with a changing Republican field tonight. Good evening, Carl.
Hi, Bret. The New Hampshire primary is in the history books, and so are two of the candidates. Both New Jersey Governor Christie and Fiorina were not likely to make the debate stage coming on Saturday in South Carolina because they couldn't meet the criteria of the necessary poll numbers. That made it very hard for them to get oxygen. There was also the question of money and poor showings in New Hampshire, as well as in Iowa, where Christie really wasn't very much of a competitor. This ends their candidacy. The only woman in the race, New Jersey Governor Christie, came in third among the governors last night in New Hampshire. Didn't give them a lot of running room in South Carolina, so they have both suspended their candidacies. Effectively, that means they're over. They could start up, but almost never do. They both spent their time talking to donors and their staffs all afternoon, and now it's official. They are officially suspended. Now we have only 6 major candidates to go forward in the Republican primary. Bret.
A huge win in New Hampshire. He and Hillary Clinton are heading west for a debate in Milwaukee tomorrow and the Nevada caucus a week from Saturday. Today, Sanders was in New York, where the senator met with Reverend Al Sharpton, perhaps looking for a key endorsement to help shore up some of the black vote that is key to winning South Carolina later this month. And despite her New Hampshire drubbing, Clinton's team appears focused on the general, assuming her today released a new ad imagining a future with Donald Trump as commander-in-chief. Chief White House correspondent Ed Henry is in Manchester. Good evening, Ed. You know, coming out of last night, it seems Hillary Clinton is in for a longer, more expensive battle for the nomination.
That's right. Good evening, Bret. I mean, it might be wishful thinking on the Clinton team's part to say we're going to be facing Donald Trump. They got to get past Bernie Sanders. He raised an astounding $5.2 million overnight. Clinton campaign manager Robbie Mook trying to calm everyone down with a memo saying, look, the first 4 early states only have about 4% of the delegates needed for the nomination. The first 15 days of March, there'll be over 1,800 delegates. But on the Sanders side, the campaign manager Jeff Weaver there told me, look, Democrats vote proportionally, so the delegates are divided if you come in first and second. It's not winner take all, and that could make a big difference. Listen.
You don't have to win everywhere in the Democratic primary process. You have to win more often than you lose. He is going to have the resources to go all the way to the convention.
Now, you put that reality together with the money that's pouring in over the internet, and even if Hillary Clinton does survive and get the nomination down the road, it's going to be a long, bloody fight, Bret.
You know, Ed, Clinton allies keep talking about this southern firewall in South Carolina, but she has to get through Nevada first.
That's right. And basically, Sanders aides tell me that they have more field offices in Nevada than Hillary Clinton does. They have more paid staffers, even though she's been banking all of this money. And they also say that, look, Clinton has an advantage among Hispanics in Nevada. She also has this advantage, as you noted, with African Americans in South Carolina. To start the days ahead, a son of a Polish immigrant, and also new information. I'm told tonight by Sanders aides they've already cut an ad with African American friends of his who were there in 1963 when Bernie Sanders was arrested for standing up for African Americans getting voting rights and other rights. It could be very powerful. It's something they're planning to deploy in South Carolina and all through the South, Bret.
Interesting. Ed, back to the Republicans. Bring back Carl here. Carl, in the past, South Carolina's really give the race a lot of focus and maybe even pare down the field more. Is that how many Republicans are looking at South Carolina?
No, quite the contrary. The current calendar, the 2016 RNC, the Republican National Committee, put this calendar together, essentially accelerating the race to get it over with fairly quickly. The idea being that about half of the Republican convention delegates would be available to win by March 15th, the first day on which there will be winner take all. But as Ed was talking about for Democrats, they are all proportionally allocated up until that point. It was essentially designed based upon what happened in 2012, the idea being that Mitt Romney was leading in the polls, but an awful lot of the Republican Republicans in the field kept on sort of biting at his ankles, and it wounded his candidacy for the general election. The idea was to avoid that this time, and it's effectively turned things upside down. Donald Trump at the top of the polls roars into South Carolina after last night's New Hampshire win with a lot of momentum. He's self-funding, and he has been doing a lot of campaigning in the southern states that make up the Super Tuesday, so-called SEC states in the Old South. And so for Trump, he's not going anywhere. Ted Cruz, strong in the South, in South Carolina particularly, he has an opportunity for a big comeback after a rather disappointing third position last night, where he's been complaining that Marco Rubio got third in Iowa and got tons of attention, and he doesn't seem to be getting that bounce. So don't look for South Carolina to win the field all that much. All of the remaining 6 have either the money and or the organization on the ground to keep going for several more weeks at least.
Clearly it could get negative there in South Carolina, as it has before. Thank you, Ed, and thank you, Carl. Let's get a lay of the land for South Carolina. 6 GOP candidates are popping up across the state as they attend events there today. Senior national correspondent John Roberts is in Spartanburg to set the stage for what could be an epic battle.
The lights had barely been turned out in New Hampshire when the Republican candidates hit the ground in South Carolina. Ted Cruz boasting that his third-place finish in a state he was supposed to lose badly is his ticket forward.
This is a national campaign. And one of the most important conclusions coming out of these first 2 states, that the only is
eventful or born again, a group instrumental in propelling Cruz to victory in Iowa. Donald Trump is appealing to the same disaffected voters who pushed him over the top in New Hampshire, as well as the huge military vote here. Ahead of a big event at Clemson tonight, Trump's campaign launched an Obama's
decider who just can't be trusted.
After being left at the side of the road in Iowa, Jeb Bush comes into South Carolina with a head of steam from his 4th place finish in New Hampshire. Bush has deep family ties here. His brother, the former president, expected to campaign for him. Bush pledging to keep taking it to Donald Trump.
He said, we're going to bomb using a vulgarity. And I, for one, as a candidate for president, here's another commitment to you. Unless I'm caught with a camera that I didn't see, I'm not going to use profanity in the public.
The Bush surge in New Hampshire was the worst possible outcome for fellow Floridian Marco Rubio, who blamed his disappointing 5th place New Hampshire finish on the now infamous debate moment Saturday night. On the way to South Carolina, he pledged to do better.
In 7 of those debates, I did very well in those debates. I had, a bad incident at the beginning of this debate, and it clouded everything else we talked about.
A big question in the Palmetto State: how will John Kasich, who finished 2nd in New Hampshire, fare? He has very little organization here and polls in the low single digits. On the trail today, Kasich pledged to resist South Carolina's famous bare-knuckle politics.
So I'm not going to be a pincushion or a marshmallow. But I'm also not going to spend my time trying to trash other people. I'll tell you why. Because if this message works, it's fantastic.
The latest polls are a couple of weeks old, but at last count, Donald Trump led the pack by some 16 points. 50 delegates at stake here in South Carolina, proportionally allocated, but still more than Iowa and New Hampshire combined. Bret?
John Roberts bouncing around South Carolina in Clemson tonight. John, thanks. Please join me Friday night for the premiere of a new special on the voter revolt that's gaining momentum as the primary season takes off. We'll talk to experts and people like you about what's driving this unprecedented wave of political insurgency. Here's a sample.
I think faith voters are taken for granted. That the Republican establishment just assumes that the faith voters are going to vote for them. They assume that.
And it's the wrong assumption.
I think it is, and that's one of the reasons why I've taken this effort for these 50-state tour. I want to get Christians, evangelical Christians, to vote. I'm not going to tell them who to vote for. I want people to vote for those that they see that are people of faith and who live faith.
Eastern Time repeats 8 Eastern Saturday and Sunday. A political homecoming tonight for President Obama. Moments ago, he wrapped up a visit to Springfield, Illinois, where he got his political start as an Illinois state senator. Correspondent Kevin Cork reports earlier today the president spoke of unity and bipartisanship in addressing state lawmakers, something in short supply both in Illinois and in Washington.
9 years to the day that I first announced for this office, I still believe in that politics of hope.
For President Obama, today's trip to Springfield, Illinois, where he launched his bid for the White House, was a return to his political roots. But that return has been over. Decision powers must be halted pending further review.
This is pure and simple a climate change regulation, and no matter what your opinion on climate change is, this regulation would be all pain and no gain.
The Justice's 5-4 decision has cast increasing doubt about the legal strength of some of the president's key legacy items, including executive actions on climate change, immigration, and attempts to strengthen Obamacare.
Over the last 7 years, this president has pushed some of the costliest regulations in the history of the Republic, including the Clean Power Plan, the ozone rule, and waters of the United States.
On Capitol Hill today, many Republican lawmakers accuse the president of executive overreach, and some experts think that's why the High Court's move is so pivotal.
The president is again attempting to accomplish, through his administrative, bureaucratic decisions, that which the Congress refused to do. I believe that this will profoundly affect his legacy.
An executive power rebuke that could have a sweeping effect on the president's agenda and could be felt for some time to come. After all, a new press takes office and new High Court justices. 3 current justices, Ginsburg, Scalia, and Kennedy, will be in their 80s by Election Day. And another, Stephen Baier, will be in his late 70s.
Obviously underscoring the importance of the 2016 election. By the way, Bret, the EPA can neither implement nor enforce the CPP, that's the Clean Power Plan, until it has been fully adjudicated and resolved by the courts. Bret?
Kevin Cork live on the North Lawn. Kevin, thank you. Federal Reserve Chair Janet Yellen told Congress today the bank will be cautious about raising interest rates in the coming months. The economy has hit some turbulence since the Fed raised its record low rate in December. Stocks were mixed today. The Dow lost 100. The S&P 500 was off a third. The Nasdaq gained 15. The U.S. is calling out Russia for actually helping ISIS through its support of Bashar al-Assad and his regime in Syria. The administration's point man for fighting ISIS, Bret says a Russian-backed government offensive in northern Syria is drawing rebels away from the ISIS fight. Iranian forces are also battling the anti-government fighters around the city of Aleppo. Some of those rebels are backed by the CIA. The president, who promised to end the nation's longest war, is sending more troops back to Afghanistan. National Security Correspondent Jennifer Griffin has the numbers and the reasons from the Pentagon tonight.
For the first time since combat operations were declared over in Afghanistan a little over a year ago, the Pentagon is sending a battalion of 500 soldiers to halt an advance by the Taliban in the volatile Helmand province, a serious about-face for the Obama administration, which pulled all units in 14. Just 14 months later, the Taliban have made a comeback. The Army's 287 Infantry Battalion out of Fort Drum, New York, will be the unit going to Helmand. The outgoing U.S. commander in Afghanistan, General John Campbell, has pushed to slow the drawdown. Current rules of engagement prevent U.S. forces from striking the Taliban, except in self-defense.
Our country has made the decision that we are not at war with the Taliban.
General David Petraeus, who commanded U.S. forces in Afghanistan until 2011, argued in a recent op-ed, quote, "We do not need a big U.S. troop buildup in Afghanistan, but we should take the gloves off of those who are there." Last month, an American Special Forces soldier was killed and 2 others wounded in an hours-long firefight alongside Afghan forces in Helmand, another sign that U.S. forces are still engaged in combat in Afghanistan. Last week, General Campbell told lawmakers that a quarter of Afghanistan is at risk of falling to the Taliban.
I think the Taliban know that we downsized. I think the Taliban understand that in the past they couldn't gather in larger formations. I think we've seen this year that they have taken advantage of the reduction of the number of coalition aircraft.
Airstrikes in 2015 were down 2/3 from the year before. There are 9,800 U.S. troops in Afghanistan right now. That number is supposed to fall to 5,500 by the end of this year. General Campbell would not say how many U.S. troops he thinks should stay.
Announcing numbers provides the enemy maybe in their mind that they can wait us out.
The U.S. military no longer has any bases in Helmand province. The 500 U.S. soldiers will have to go to a former U.S. base turned over to the Afghans, making this deployment all the more challenging. Bret?
Jennifer Griffin live at the Pentagon. Jennifer, thank you. This is a Fox News alert. The Senate has just voted for legislation broadening sanctions on North Korea over its nuclear program, human rights record, and cyber activities. The vote was 96-0. The House passed a similar bill last month. The differences between the two bills are expected to be resolved quickly, and Senate Democrats say tonight they expect President Obama to sign this measure into law. Up next, it seems Hillary Clinton had plenty of company in getting top secret information on her homebrew server. We'll explain. First, here's what some of our Fox affiliates around the country are covering tonight. Fox 28 in Columbus, as a bill stripping government funds from Planned Parenthood works its way to the desk of Ohio Governor and presidential candidate John Kasich. Some are questioning the timing, since the measure obviously could help Kasich appeal to conservative voters in the South. Fox 2 in St. Louis, as the Justice Department announces a civil rights lawsuit against Ferguson. This comes one day after the city council voted to revise an agreement aimed at improving how police and courts treat poor people and minorities there. Ferguson has been under scrutiny since the police shooting death of an unarmed black man 18 months ago. And this is a live look at Los Angeles from Fox 11. One of the big stories there tonight, LA public schools themselves. The district says immigration and customs officers can no longer set foot on school property without permission. Parents have reportedly been alarmed since ICE agents began a series of raids in January targeting Central American immigrants. That's tonight's live look outside the Beltway from Special Report. We'll be right back. It appears Hillary Clinton is not the only former State Department employee being investigated for having top secret information run through the Clintons' homebrew server. Chief Intelligence Correspondent Catherine Harridge has the latest on the Clinton email scandal.
A U.S. government official says more than a dozen email accounts handled the top secret classified information found on Mrs. Clinton's unsecured server, and there is no evidence they were authorized to receive it. The official include, but also her closest aides, Cheryl Mills, Huma Abedin, Jake Sullivan, Philippe Reines, as well as State Department Undersecretary for Management Patrick Kennedy. Fox News pressed the State Department on whether a damage assessment is being done.
Obviously, those are concerns we take seriously, and going forward, we'll take steps to address those concerns.
Beyond this week's letter confirming the FBI investigation is focused on Mrs. Clinton's server, the Bureau has not publicly acknowledged who it's contacted or interviewed. A source familiar with Patrick Kennedy's testimony before the House Benghazi Committee said he knew from the beginning, claimed he learned about the setup much later.
That he did not have knowledge of the computer server that she had set up, the personal email or computer server she set up at her residence.
New documents released after a federal lawsuit show that in June, Kennedy instructed Clinton lawyer David Kendall to delete 25 emails from the backup hard drive because they contained classified information. The topics range from North Korea, a conversation with China's foreign minister, to an arms treaty.
This quiet, cautious letter was damage control. Potential can come in and intervene.
Former intelligence officer says there is a universal feeling that the Clinton email issue is far more sensitive than the general public realizes, and there's no doubt the intelligence community is conducting damage assessments and evaluating the viability of any exposed operation, Bret.
Okay, we'll follow it. Thank you, Catherine. The head of the Center for Disease Control says more money is needed to find and understand the Zika virus. Dr. Tom Frieden made his plea today before a congressional subcommittee. Meanwhile, scientists are trying to combat Zika by building a better mosquito. Correspondent Jonathan Seri shows us the high-tech fight against a virus that spreads the old-fashioned way.
British biotech company Oxitec has produced a genetically modified version of the mosquito that carries the Zika virus. When it mates with mosquitoes in the wild, the offspring die before reaching maturity. Oxitec says its mosquito has already shown promising results in tests outside the U.S.
We've reduced that mosquito population in these towns by over 90% within about 6 months, which is the new side.
Part of that is because chemical spraying misses many of the breeding areas of the Zika-carrying mosquito, such as the inside of people's homes.
It's not like these mosquitoes are just in the swamp, in the rice fields, in the rural areas. These mosquitoes thrive around people.
The idea of waging war on Zika with genetically modified insects has given rise to unproven conspiracy theories as well as concerns about the ecological impact. But Oxitec insists it's safer than many conventional mosquito control methods.
What you're trying to do with insecticides is wipe out all insect life where you apply the insecticide. Ours is actually much more of a precision instrument. We're just trying to combat the one species that's spreading disease at the moment.
At the University, they hope to have it ready in 5 to 7 years.
For emergency use, a vaccine could be on the market much faster if it's needed. It depends on how fast Zika spreads throughout the Americas and into the United States. So that time frame could be as short as 2 years if necessary.
At least a dozen research groups are working on developing vaccines or treatments for the Zika virus. Meanwhile, Oxitec is seeking FDA approval to conduct field trials of its modified mosquitoes in the Florida Keys. Tonight, the FDA tells Fox News it does not have a timeline for when it will complete its evaluation. Bret?
Jonathan Seri live in Atlanta. Jonathan, thank you. With both presidential races extremely competitive so far, it appears we may be taking a long and winding road to the conventions. We'll lay out the path next. Officials in North Carolina, U.S. details.
Well, Bret, the state is fighting to block a lower court decision finding that 2 North Carolina congressional districts were crafted with too much reliance on race and must be redrawn by the end of next week. North Carolina Governor Pat McCrory and other state officials say that is nearly impossible and could throw the state's entire voting process into disarray. The state's emergency request went to Chief Justice John Roberts based solely on the geographic region it comes from. He can decide this alone or refer it to the full court for a decision, but time is clearly of the essence. In North Carolina's emergency request to Roberts, it states this, quote, North Carolina's election process started months ago. Thousands of absentee ballots have been distributed to voters who are filling them out and returning them. Hundreds of those ballots have already been voted and returned. North Carolina's NAACP helps spearhead the fight against the current boundary lines, calling them, quote, racially biased apartheid voting districts aimed at disenfranchising African American voters. The Chief Justice has asked the opposing side of this case to file a reply to North Carolina's emergency request by next Tuesday, just 3 days before the deadline to get those 2 congressional districts redrawn. Bret?
Shannon, thank you. America's election headquarters in depth tonight. Much like the general election is actually about the Electoral College, primaries are primarily about delegates. So how are we doing so far? Chief Washington correspondent James Rosen tells us we've barely begun.
There's so much going to happen. If you don't have a seatbelt, go get one.
You'll hear lots of numbers tossed around in the GOP presidential primary, but the one that matters most is 1,237. Majority nominated to February, when South Carolina and Nevada will have weighed in, 95% of all delegates will still be up for grabs.
You got a Trump lane, clear. You got a Cruz lane because he's got evangelicals and libertarians. And then you've got a third lane of all the establishment Republicans.
13 states will vote on Super Tuesday, March 1st, but by Hangover Wednesday, nearly 70% of delegates will still be unspoken for. By March 12th, another 11 states will have weighed in. But RNC rules have made practically all the early voting states proportional, meaning even losing Candidates can pick up delegates and hang in there.
You remember, Mitt Romney didn't really become the president ago. You know, this is going to take a while.
Not until March 15th will we see the first true winner-take-all contest in Florida, a state the frontrunners may skip because it is the home state of Marco Rubio and Jeb Bush.
It will narrow just kind of organically because people run out of money and people run out of time. And I'm in it for the long haul.
And for that long haul, cash is critical both for ground game and TV ads. The super PACs supporting Ted Cruz, Jeb Bush, and Marco Rubio all of millions. Trump doesn't place New Hampshire as the candidate most urgently in need of a seatbelt.
The truth of the matter is Trump's got a real role on this thing, and it's going to be hard to stop. Kasich is now the establishment candidate, but he is not doing well in South Carolina, and equally as important, he has no resources, he has no money. Not much staff.
Exit polls showed New Hampshire Republicans who rank the economy and jobs as their top issue, who worry about terrorist attacks, burn out Donald Trump. Those preferring political experience and a candidate who, quote, shares my views, broke for Kasich. Bret?
James, thank you. Donald Trump with a huge win. He and most of the Republican contenders head south, but not everyone's going. We'll talk about it all with the panel when we come back.
Tonight if we'd actually won. This is a pretty exciting event, and I'm very grateful to all of you.
We harness the energy and the excitement that the Democratic Party will need to succeed in November.
Maybe, just maybe, we're turning the page on a dark part of American politics, because tonight the light overcame the darkness of negative campaigning.
New Hampshire, I want to thank you. We love you. We're going to be back a lot. We're not going to forget you. You started it. Remember, you started it.
The second place finishers and the big winners from last night in New Hampshire. As you Republican side, he up with a huge win. John Kasich with a strong second. And there you see the rest of the field. The rest of the field is smaller, actually, now, and you can see the candidates who have dropped out of this race so far, and you can see all the way back to Governor Walker there and Governor Perry, but Christie and Carly Fiorina are now among them, dropping out of this race. Now quickly you look at the Democratic results from last night, and Bernie Sanders again with a big win. Let's bring in our panel. Set the table. Steve Hayes, senior writer for the Weekly Standard. Ron Fournier, senior political columnist of National Journal, and syndicated columnist Charles Krauthammer. Okay, let's start with the Christie and Fiorina stepping aside. Obviously, Christie had to have a good moment in New Hampshire, and despite that debate where he really took down Marco Rubio, he didn't get any benefit.
Well, that actually has happened before in other races. If you're in a multi-candidate race, you can score a big hit on somebody, but that doesn't guarantee you're going to succeed. In fact, often it hurts you as well. Look, what happened to Christie was a suicide, a political suicide attack, where he looked a little bit, I thought, overbearing, but even if it had no effect on him, it didn't help him, and by bringing down Rubio, which Rubio admitted, it helped all the other so-called mainstream candidates.
Ron.
I think Christie and Carly are two of the better political athletes in the field. The Republican Party is worse off for them being gone, just pure political skills. I agree with you completely. We saw the same kind of thing happen in 2004 on the Democrat side with Gephardt going nuclear, and it affected him. I think, though, that Christie has done a service both to his party, to the country, and to Rubio. Rubio has been somewhat of an empty suit. Rubio did have to learn a lesson that he's got to get beyond his talking points and be able to be more of a facile politician. And Christie exposed that. Doesn't mean Rubio can't overcome it, but he's got to be better than he was last weekend.
Neither one, we should point out, Steve, has endorsed anyone, at least not yet. And for Chris Christie, I would guess that would be an interesting choice.
I would think so. I would think it'd be hard for him to endorse Marco Rubio at this point, given all of the things that he said about Rubio over the past week. He's got obviously an affinity toward the governors. He spent much of his time in the race making an argument in favor of an executive moving to the White House, but he's also close with Donald Trump. I mean, there have been times where Christie has had an open shot at Donald Trump and has basically refused to take it. Not to say that he's never been critical, but he hasn't taken some of the obvious shots. And when I interviewed him before the debate in Charleston at some length, I walked through a people rate Trump as a president, and Christie said, absolutely I do.
Let's take a listen to some of the other speeches from last night. You may have heard.
The votes are still being counted, and the exact results are unknown. But right now it appears that we are effectively tied for third in the state of New Hampshire.
Granted, staters understand that this is a race not to be on the backbench of the United States Senate. We're electing the President of the United States, a person that has to make tough decisions.
Our disappointment tonight is not on you. It's on me. It's on me. I did not do well on Saturday night, so listen to this. That will never happen again.
Ted Cruz today got a little pointed, saying he expected full coverage from Fox News about his third place finish. He did finish third, and we did mention that it was a significant moment because New Hampshire doesn't line up for Ted Cruz. He expected more of focus on that.
But remember, it's always our fault, no matter who wins or loses. But I think Cruz really comes out of this as the strongest non-Trump candidate. Bush, he spent a lot of money. He got fourth. Rubio got hit really hard, although I think he has a chance in the coming debate to undo that. And Kasich is a guy who doesn't have a lot going for him outside of New Hampshire. He put all his resources in there, and he's the poor man in the field. South Carolina is not exactly his play. Cruz has money. He's got organization. He's got evangelicals in South Carolina that are about 60% of the electorate. In New Hampshire, they're about 23%. He's got conservatives there. I think it's his territory. And I think so, of all the challengers, who's going to be the last man standing? Right now, I'd say you'd have to put your money on Cruz.
So you're changing your Canada casino calculations as of tonight. We'll get you on Friday.
I still have 2 days.
Yeah,
I have to count my money first, and then I'll see.
Okay, Ron.
Trump is by far the front runner. Cruz right now is the only one who clearly has a shot at taking him out. The vaunted establishment lane looks like it was built for clown cars.
I mean, that Trump win, you're talking about lapping the field.
Extraordinary. No, I mean, it is really.
And the ground game, there wasn't really what we could see, a big ground game.
He talked about it in his speech, in his celebratory speech, talked about the great ground game. But I mean, you talk to people in New Hampshire who would have been responsible for such a ground game, and they didn't really have much of a ground game. He was able to do what he wasn't able to do, which was get people to polls based on enthusiasm about Donald Trump, not because they had a big ground operation. I will say, I do think Ted Cruz deserves a lot of credit for what he did in New Hampshire. I mean, in third place in New Hampshire, he spent $800,000 in New Hampshire. Jeb Bush spent $36 million combined between his campaign and his super PAC to come in fourth. Ted Cruz spent $800,000 and came in third. He spent 27 days in the state. This was not a priority for Ted Cruz. He comes out of there, I think, looking pretty good.
Plus, structurally, the state favors Bush much more than Cruz, so I agree.
In New Hampshire?
In New Hampshire, yeah. So Cruz overperformed in New Hampshire, no doubt about it.
Next up, Bernie Sanders crushes Hillary Clinton in New Hampshire, but can he break down her southern firewall? Is that there anymore? Next.
The president has signaled, while still remaining neutral, that he supports Clinton's. But I don't think there's any doubt that he wants Hillary to win the nomination and believes that she would be the best candidate in the fall and the most effective as president in carrying forward what he's achieved.
Former White House press secretary talking about the president and his support, he says, of Hillary Clinton in the Democratic nomination. Meantime, Bernie Sanders today in New York meeting with Al Sharpton, talking about, among other things, support by African Americans as he gets ready to head down to South Carolina eventually. The Democrats first head to Nevada. He will have a lot of support financially. The Sanders campaign put out a statement saying in the 18 hours since the polls closed in the Granite State, the Sanders campaign has raised more than $5.2 million, shattering the campaign's previous record for money raised in less than a day. The average donation since Sanders' speech, $34. We're back with the panel. Ron.
I think that just like we saw Hillary Clinton taking women voters for granted, that she might be taking black voters for granted. And if I'm Bernie Sanders, I run to the left of Hillary and to the left of Barack Obama on racial disparity in sentences. And I talk about how the Clinton White House, they're tough on crime punishment, put a lot of African Americans in jail, who would be out under sentences that the new sentencing guidelines that Congress has since passed, and even President Obama hasn't used his clemency power to free these folks. It would be a good way for him to stand up to the president and stand up to Hillary and show the community more than just talk.
We should point out that the reason they're going to Nevada, the Democrats, before South Carolina, is because Harry Reid insisted that Nevada had to be next in line. So they are heading to Nevada, and Steve, it seems like the Sanders people are exuding confidence, even though organizationally Clinton probably has the upper hand across the country.
Yeah, I think that's true, although Sanders has done some advanced spending in some of these states that are coming up. Look, I think they have every right to exude confidence, in part because of what they've done. I do think New Hampshire resets the race. I think New Hampshire would have reset the race if he beat her by 10 points, but to beat her by 20 plus is just extraordinary. I don't care that he lives next door. It's a big moment, I think, in Democratic politics today. The $34 a minute that he raised is truly extraordinary, $5.2 million overnight. And if I had to wager, I would say that it probably spiked when Hillary Clinton was speaking last night, giving her concession speech. Because if you wanted a perfect 20-minute example of what I think a lot of people believe is wrong with our politics, watch that speech where Hillary Clinton talks about the need to get big money out of politics, to reduce the influence of Wall Street. I mean, it was every one of these things on which she's been guilty. She would be the avatar for that on the Democratic side of the ledger. And she's criticizing it because she needs to fight off Bernie Sanders. And I think it also gives us some indication of just how seriously they're now taking him. They didn't before, but they're taking him seriously now.
You know, we talk a lot about the establishment fight and the outsiders on the Republican side. There is an establishment fight on the Democratic side. She is leaving New Hampshire, actually, it turns out, with more delegates than Bernie Sanders, even though she loses by 22 points because of superdelegates and the way Democrats have it stacked up. Those are insiders inside the party, elected officials who she has on her side, and yet she lost huge.
If she keeps losing by 3 touchdowns, it won't matter how many superdelegates she has. There's no way that the party could engineer a victory for her, because it would cause a riot that would make 1968 look like a picnic. So it matters what happens in the results, despite the fact that perhaps if we're way down the road and it's a very narrow margin like Reagan, Ford in 1976, the weight of the party might make a difference. But right now, I mean, she took such a shellacking, and it shows. I mean, look, we were debating, do the emails have any effect, this whole sort of the baggage that she carries. On the honesty issue, the spread was 88 points. Saddam had a smaller spread than that on honesty and essentially authenticity. And it turns out that it has had a profound effect on Democrats. Imagine what it would do in the general election. And look, I do think that her advantage on the question of African American and Hispanic constituencies is the only remaining question. If she can hang on to them, she will fend them off. If that barrier collapses, then she's out.
But quickly, Ron, on the honest and trustworthy, how much do you think, you know, we talk about the email scandal, but really the Wall Street side is what Bernie Sanders was hitting?
Look, trust is something that infuses every policy issue. That was the problem with the email scandal. Not the emails necessarily in the Democratic primary, but you can make all the promises in the world, and if they think that you're not good to your word, they're going to look somewhere else. And Bernie Sanders, love him or hate him, looks awfully authentic.
Next up, you have your say on our Contenders app. from the Fox News app. The statement about gun control that was most agreed with was, quote, law-abiding gun owners are not the problem in this country. The problem are criminals, and criminals don't care what laws you pass. You can pass all the gun laws in the world that you want. It will not stop the criminals. That statement belongs to Florida Senator Marco Rubio. Here is how all the candidates did. The scale is 1 to 100, with 1 meaning complete disagreement and 100 total agreement. Users also ranked the middle class topic as a fairly important issue, ranking it on average 4 out of 5 stars. So we had the panel take the quiz. So Steve, what do you think? What'd you end up with?
That was pretty interesting, actually. I ended up with Ted Cruz, who was just finished just below Marco Rubio on that one.
And you couldn't find one.
I flunked.
You flunked. I mean, look, do you know how it works?
I know. You know what? I have my daughter show me how the technology thing works. Matter of fact, I could tweet you right now if you like, like Bret was doing the other day.
Exactly.
Look, they're all statements by politicians who have poll tested it. It's all absolutism and red herrings, and right. I didn't agree with any of them.
You're not a good test subject, Charles.
Exactly. I'm not a good panelist either.
Always attack the media, right?
Exactly.
Rubio and Sanders is number 2.
Wow. Thanks for inviting us into your home tonight. That's it for this special report. Fair, balanced, and unafraid. No online show tonight. Here's Greg.